You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the French presidential elections. Aggressive, bitter, bruising. Commentators compared the only televised debate ahead of Sunday's runoff presidential vote to a heavyweight title fight. President Nicolas Sarkozy punched away like a boxer. His socialist usurper, François Hollande, dodged and wrong-footed the incumbent with judo-like finesse. But despite 3 hours in the ring, watched by some 18 million viewers, there was perhaps no knockout blow. And the contest remains massively stacked in Mr. Hollande's favour, leading the polls by between 6 and 10 percentage points. So why has the French electorate turned on President Sarkozy? What does the first round success of the far-right Marine Le Pen say about the state of French politics? And what could happen when a President Hollande takes his anti-austerity message to a cash-strapped Europe? To probe these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studio. I'm joined by Rainbow Murray from Queen Mary University of London, John Gaffney from Aston University, John Laughland from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris, and Nick Hewlett from Warwick University. OK, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single-sentence answer from each of you to the following question. First of all, to you, Rainbow, who came out top on Wednesday night?
It started out with Hollande in the lead. I think Sarkozy pulled it back, and in the end it was much of a draw. OK, a draw. John?
Neither of them won, and therefore Sarkozy lost.
OK, and the other John, Laughland in Paris?
I think François Hollande won the debate. I was struck by the presidential air that he managed to assume, and it was almost as if Nicolas Sarkozy was the challenger. And I think, independently of the policy issues that they argued over, that basic image came very strongly across.
And Nick Hewlett?
I think there was a stalemate, really. Both of them made good points, and both of them failed once or twice. So I think, really, the polls are going to stay the same.
Turning to you, John Laughland, at that point, can you tell us where you saw the debate last night? Were you with other people? And maybe you can give us a bit of a sense of the feeling from Paris.
Well, it's a debate that has attracted a huge audience, as you said in your introduction. I think something like 17 million viewers. Because, of course, this second round is the real election. I've been a long critic of the two-round electoral system because in the first round, people can vote for whomever they like, knowing that it really doesn't make any difference or makes very little difference. Whereas, of course, in the second round, the choice is a real one. So that explains the massive level of interest in this debate, because finally people have to make a choice between the two candidates. So there was a very great deal of interest, and I think for the first time really in the debate, the alternatives, if you like, became clear. There was an awful lot of political hot air, I feel, in the earlier part of the election campaign for the first round, in which it was rather difficult to see what separated the two candidates. But I think now that it's a binary choice, the differences have indeed become clearer.
And in your opening remarks, you said that Hollande came off as looking a little bit presidential, and that was something of a surprise, because many thought that when he'd go up against the heavy-fighting Mr. Sarkozy, that he would crumble.
Yes, I do think it's important. Obviously, he's been in the lead now, I think, in every single opinion poll, and there must have been dozens, if not hundreds of them. So there's very little doubt about the real result. But I was struck, as I said, by the way in which he managed to pull off the right attitude. And I was in particular struck by the contrast between this debate last night and the other great historic debates that people remember, for example, between Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in 1981 and François Mitterrand, or between Mitterrand and Chirac in 1988. On both of those occasions, which have entered, I would say, French political history as great debates, and of course very decisive ones, the incumbent president managed to pull off a number of very important put-downs to the challenger. They weren't always successful because, of course, Giscard lost against Mitterrand. But nonetheless, that was the, as it were, balance of power in the debate. This time it was the other way around. It was Hollande who appeared, I would say, almost to be the incumbent, and Sarkozy the challenger. And that, I think, will only further damage Sarkozy's already very damaged reputation.
Rainbow, Hollande coming off as presidential, is that true, or did the two trade so many insults and get so down and dirty with each other that nobody came off well?
This was a battle to project the right image for both candidates. Hollande has a bit of an image at the moment of being rather dull, rather uninteresting. He needed to show that he had fire in his belly, that he was capable of putting up a fight. And I think he did that. He showed that he wasn't going to be intimidated by Sarkozy. He didn't let Sarkozy pull any punches over him. Sarkozy had a challenge in that he had to stand up to Hollande, and at the same time he needed to tackle his image as being someone who's very aggressive, very negatively perceived by the French voters. So I think it was much more of an uphill struggle for Sarkozy. And at first, he very obviously struggled to find the right tone. He was going in too aggressive. He calmed down as the debate proceeded, to the point where at the end he was criticised for perhaps being too docile. When Hollande made his big closing speech, Sarkozy just sat quietly and listened and didn't interrupt him once. And this was picked up on by several pundits afterwards as a criticism.
Turning to you in the studio, John Gaffney, that's true, Sarkozy did go over the top sometimes. There were lots of comments that came from him. He called Hollande a little slanderer. He said, it's a lie, it's a lie. I mean, this wasn't exactly presidential style behaviour, was it?
No, it wasn't. And I think both the points that Rainbow and John made are absolutely spot on, that Hollande did manage to come across as more presidential. And Sarkozy, in a sense, had the enormous disadvantage that he's trying to defend a contested 5-year term, did look like the challenger. He thought he would knock Hollande out, but Hollande has always been actually quite a good television debater. So the notion that this was going to be the decisive punch, and the decisive punch didn't come. So although, yes, they did get down and dirty, the two of them, and so on, but Hollande actually managed to look as if he was going to fill the shoes.
Nick Hewlett from Warwick University. Here's a comment from an editorial in Le Monde by François Fresseau. He said, it was a draw, but as Mr. Hollande started as favourite, he remains the favourite. Mr. Sarkozy did not manage to destabilise him, which was his objective from the start. Is that how you see it?
I think that's probably right, yes. Sarkozy, although he tried to appear statesmanlike, although he tried to use the fact that he is president and has been president to his advantage, in fact, of course, it's a disadvantage, and he was on his back foot. You know, this man has been the least popular president of the entire Fifth Republic since 1958. He's deeply divided many, many groups, and he constantly referred back to his presidency, to his 5-year term, but this probably was not a good idea, and he didn't manage to project forward. He didn't manage to suggest really that he was going to be the president of the future. So I absolutely agree with other guests around the table and in Paris that this was not a fight which Sarkozy won.
John Laughland, turning to you in Paris, that's very true, isn't it? What you were saying before is that Sarkozy, although he is president, of course, the incumbent, he was going into this contest as a challenger. How is he perceived in France at the current time? France with economic problems, 10% unemployment, and if you look across the Eurozone countries, it's obviously been very hard for an incumbent to go into an election and keep his job.
Well, it has, but as François Hollande was very keen to point out, certain other countries in Europe, or a certain other country in Europe, I'm talking, of course, about Germany, has managed to pull its chestnuts out of the fire very well in this economic crisis. One of the big points that Hollande made throughout the debate was how well Germany has done economically and how less well France has done. And he also made the other absolutely key point at one stage in the debate where he said, Sarkozy, you have been in power for 10 years. And we should never forget this. Sarkozy is, of course, has only been president for 5 years, but before that he was a minister under Jacques Chirac, and the right-wing parties have been in power since 2002. So he's got a long record to defend, and that record, I would say, is mixed, and that's why he appears so weak in this debate.
We were talking there about the record of Sarkozy. Although he's had certain pluses in his career, for example, appearing quite presidential and leading France and leading Europe when it comes to issues like Libya and striking deals with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel on the bailing out of other European economies, there have also been some weaknesses too. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. You've mentioned the international stage, and I suppose that's probably his area of strength, if there has been one. As you say, he's done quite well as far as Europe is concerned, as far as Libya is concerned, I suppose, along with David Cameron, for example. So these are areas where he has appeared presidential. Quite a lot of the time he hasn't, though, and he's had a real image problem. This is a man who has displayed bouts of irascibility, of volatility. He hasn't held back when he wanted to speak his mind about various different groups, and none were spared, including bankers, for example, but also teachers, journalists, farmers, of course, most infamously, who he told to clear off to an individual who refused to shake his hand, and I'm putting it politely, and so on and so forth. Clearly, 27% of the electorate, or the people who actually voted, did vote for Sarkozy, so we shouldn't overlook that, of course. But I wonder if the most convincing conclusion we can draw from this election is that most people voted against another candidate rather than in favour of the candidate they put a cross against, rather oddly.
Maybe turning to you in the studio there, Rainbow, Nick was talking about negative voting. And do you think that it's fair to say that Sarkozy has suffered from this really strong sense of Sarkophobia? And what do you think is the cause of that?
I think it is true that a lot of people have voted against Sarkozy as much as they voted for Hollande. Even when rallying towards Hollande in the second round, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who scored an impressive 11% in the first round, called on voters to vote against Sarkozy rather than explicitly for Hollande. I think Sarkozy has rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. He's a very dynamic personality, he's a very strong personality, and that's always going to alienate some people. And in fact, this isn't a recent phenomenon. Even prior to the previous election, he was seen as a bit of a Marmite candidate. You either love him or you hate him. And a growing number of people have been given reason to hate him as he's had time in office to offend many people. And as other commentators have said, he's got a difficult track record to defend. There's an economic crisis. There's been a series of political crises. He's also been seen as quite trashy and vulgar. His personal life has been too much in the public domain. He's been seen as flashy and extravagant at a time of austerity. That hasn't played well with voters. So in a number of ways, he's rubbed people up the wrong way, and now there are a lot of people who want to see him out of power.
Turning to you, John Gaffney in the studio. Sarkozy as a Marmite character, if he is, do you love him or do you hate him?
I absolutely love him. But yeah, I think this also tells us something about the nature of the Fifth Republic, that the fact that Sarkozy is so unloved, that you get here a kind of an emotion between the president and the people that you really don't find in many other places. I mean, Ed Miliband might irritate me, or David Cameron might irritate me, but they don't stop me getting to sleep at night. Sarkozy triggers fury on the part of many French people who don't like him. But that's partly because of the nature of the presidency itself, that it is a particular kind of imagined relationship that involves emotion between the president and the people. And this was started by de Gaulle and has journeyed its way through the Fifth Republic. But here we've got a situation where there is emotion, but it's so negative. And it started the night he was elected in 2007, when he went to a rather bling-bling restaurant and celebrated and was seen as the vulgarity began. And if there's one thing the French don't like, it's vulgarity. So this tells us about the Fifth Republic, and therefore, if Hollande is elected, it would be very, very interesting to see what happens to this relationship between president and people when we have, for the very first time, a normal, in inverted commas, president elected.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the French presidential elections. I'm joined by Rainbow Murray from Queen Mary University of London, John Gaffney from Aston University, John Laughland from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris, and Nick Hewlett from Warwick University. Well, turning now away from the incumbent, who most polls would suggest is going to lose his job, Mr. Sarkozy, and towards Mr. Hollande, who is likely to take the job as the next president of France. Maybe turning to you, John. In many ways, if you look at this guy's history, he's a bit of a surprise candidate. Going back to the years of François Mitterrand's presidency in the 1980s and 1990s, he didn't hold a ministerial post. As party leader, he's presided over 2 presidential defeats. And until recently, he's been chairing local government meetings in rural central France. It seems like now he's going to be stepping into the top job. Is that something of a surprise?
Not really. I mean, we observe the same phenomenon, don't we, in other European countries, not least in Britain, where both Tony Blair and David Cameron had only ever exercised party functions before becoming Prime Minister, before getting the top job. And I'm sure Britain and France are not the only countries where this is the case. But it's true that he is a party man. He is a creation of and a product of, and of course a head of the Socialist Party. And it's in that party structure that his professional abilities have come to the fore. I think that's a bad thing. I think that politicians should have another role in life other than simply party politics. But I can't say that France is special in that respect. On the contrary, I think France is joining the European norm. And I very much agree with what was said just now about the relationship between the president and the people in the Fifth Republic. This relationship, of course, or I say of course, in my view, has greatly degraded, has greatly declined since de Gaulle first created the Fifth Republic. Back then there was a sense in which the president embodied the whole of France. But that sentiment has dissipated over time. And now, in spite of the fact that both candidates claim once again to embody it, it really doesn't correspond to any reality at all. Instead, of course, we have a straightforward left-right contest or centre-left, centre-right contest. And I think one of the interesting questions will be for the future Hollande presidency, how is he going to govern, given what we know about the French electorate and the 20% support which went to the National Front? Because that, as I think all commentators agree, is the biggest story in this election campaign. The debate between the centre-left and centre-right is relatively uninteresting, although it's become slightly more interesting in this latest debate. But the biggest fact about it is that France has yet again confirmed herself as the country with the largest, what we call extreme right electorate in Europe. I don't, by the way, think the word extreme right is correct, but anyway, let's use that term for the time being. And the biggest challenge for the new president will be to govern with the parliament which comes out of the elections in June, because, as I'm sure your listeners know, since Jacques Chirac reformed the constitution of the Fifth Republic, the parliamentary and presidential elections are now synchronized. And so in June there will be a parliamentary contest, and we will have to see whether Hollande gets a parliamentary majority.
Maybe turning to you, Nick, there. What John describes as the big story from this election is what was a surprise success in the first round of Marine Le Pen, in which 1 in 5 French voters chose her and her party, the National Front, in the first round. What do you think are the implications and fallout of this?
One thing which we have to bear in mind is that for Sarkozy to win, he would need a large number of the votes for Marine Le Pen in the first round to be transferred to him in the second round. So that's one thing to bear in mind. It looks very much that this is not going to happen, of course, particularly as Marine Le Pen herself has declared that she is going to vote for neither candidate, the implication being that her followers should do likewise. The high vote for the National Front is, of course, quite a worrying phenomenon in many people's eyes, including my own. And it does reflect a certain desperation, I think, on the part of a large number of French people, 6 million or so. This reflects in part the crisis. The vote has risen since the beginning of the crisis, of course. It reflects in part a disillusionment with the political class. Since the mid-1980s, the National Front has been polling anything from 13 up to today's 18%, something like that. It's fluctuated a bit, of course, in between. And I think with a series of either supposedly consensual type governments or governments like the one we have seen, or a president anyway, who is seen as not supporting people particularly at the bottom of the pile, because this is very much the sort of vote which Marine Le Pen is getting. It's people from, very often anyway, blue-collar working class backgrounds who are voting in increasingly large numbers for Le Pen. So I see it as a vote of desperation. Various commentators have suggested that it's less an extreme right vote, and perhaps this is what John Laughland has been suggesting, and perhaps more of a generalised protest vote. I'm not sure that I would go that far. I don't think I would, but I certainly see where these commentators are coming from.
Rainbow, turning to you there in the studio, Le Pen has announced plans for a new patriotic coalition she is creating in the hope of winning seats in Parliament next month, possibly even the 15 seats she would need to form a parliamentary group and therefore get more airtime on television and radio and a better hearing in the debates. Is this something that concerns you?
Does it concern me in terms of her likelihood to get parliamentary seats? I think it's optimistic on her part. She always speaks big. She always sees the best case scenario because she needs to make sure that voters believe that it's a credible option to vote for her. But traditionally, the FN does much better in the presidential elections than it does in the parliamentary elections. So I think we can see that parliamentary vote decline. And I think that we will see the UMP party's vote go up relative to that for Sarkozy, because I think more French people are willing to support a party of the right than they are to support Nicolas Sarkozy himself for reasons that we've previously said. A reinforced vote for the right means a reduced vote for the far right and a less impressive score for the National Front. But what we are going to see is a nuisance factor, that they are likely to qualify to the second round in a number of legislative seats. This is a phenomenon known as sort of triangles, where you've got three candidates qualifying to the second round. And so the real question now is going to be what happens to the UMP if Sarkozy loses. There's going to be a power struggle. Who is going to take over the party? And are they going to be able to get it into fighting shape in time for the legislative elections? And I think that will be the key determinant of how well the National Front does.
And that one to you, John Gaffney. Do you agree with what John Laughland said, that the substantial support for the National Front in the first round of the election is going to influence in some way that the eventual winner is going to have to behave, perhaps on issues such as immigration policy?
Well, I mean, the fact that if Hollande wins, you're going to have a socialist president and probably a socialist majority in parliament, but in a country where it is possible that the Sarkozy right will implode and you have 20% of people having voted for Marine Le Pen. Now, it's true that she has kind of detoxed the party. She isn't her father. A lot of people voted for her, the novelty of it being a woman and so on. But the legislative system will stop the Front National getting any significant representation in Parliament, but there will be this kind of protest feeling that Hollande and his government will have to cope with in the years ahead. And she may get a seat herself and therefore become a kind of a tribune because she's quite good on television, she's a relatively good speaker.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the French presidential elections. I'm joined by Rainbow Murray from Queen Mary University of London, John Gaffney from Aston University, John Laughland from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris, and Nick Hewlett from Warwick University. Moving back on to Monsieur Hollande, who's likely going to emerge as the winner of this election, and if he does, this will be the first time the socialists have been in power since way back when Ronald Reagan was in the White House and Mikhail Gorbachev was in the Kremlin. Now, a lot of the focus of the policies of the debate was on, obviously, economics. Hollande has said that he's declared a war on the world of finance. He's described the super rich as grasping and arrogant. I mean, one of his headline policies has been the 75% tax on people who earn above 1 million euros a year. Turning to you, John Laughland in Paris, is this the kind of policy that France needs?
I don't think so. I think it's the last thing that France needs, personally, and I listen to those kinds of electoral promises with great trepidation, as do many other people in France. Not it seems a majority, but many people. I think that, as Sarkozy, to be fair, said last night, France has a very serious competitivity problem. Now, I don't want to join in the usual banal British nonsense about how France must liberalise and so on, because I think that argument is a complete busted flush, not least in view of the fact that the British economy is itself once again in recession. But nonetheless, there is a very clear problem in France connected with the excessively high cost of labour. It's the highest in the whole of Europe, and in particular, of course, it's higher than Germany, which is, as everybody knows, an industrial powerhouse and which is outstripping France on every single economic indicator, from unemployment to growth. And in view of that, Hollande's statements about increasing taxes and so on, and indeed about giving votes to immigrants, these things are not compatible with his stated desire to make the French economy grow. That must be the chief priority. It's something that he's promised to try to do, but we know from past history that it's extremely difficult. France is a relatively regulated society. It is difficult to make the economy grow as much as he would like. And I think, therefore, that the economic circumstances will make his presidency a very difficult one, not to mention the political circumstances. I listen with interest to the comments that were made earlier about the likely outcome of the legislative elections. Probably the other people around the table are right, that actually things will go back to being much as before. In other words, that the centre-right party will be returned more than the National Front to Parliament. That's not Marine Le Pen's strategy, however. Her strategy is, of course, to destroy the Sarkozy party, to destroy the UMP, which was created in 2002 by Jacques Chirac precisely to defeat her father. She wants to destroy that party and to reconstitute the French right around herself, around a more radical right agenda. And it's a long shot. It's a very big challenge, and there will be many people on the right, centre-right, who will be opposed to it. Nonetheless, I don't think we should downplay the sense of febrility which there is now in the French electorate.
Can I turn back to Nick at that stage and maybe go back to Hollande and his economic policies? We understand that Hollande one of his policies is going to be to go to meet Angela Merkel and renegotiate the financial compact that Sarkozy struck a deal with in relation to bailing out the economies of Greece and other European countries. When it comes to this debate over whether or not austerity or spending is the answer, it seems that Hollande is going to err on the side of spending. And is that something that you think is going to be a good thing for France and for the Eurozone?
First of all, like most leaders, Hollande is likely to be more moderate in office than he has been in the campaign. That seems to be a fact of political life, and he's likely to fall in with a at least more neoliberal agenda than he has been promising during the election campaign. That has always tended to be the case, of course. Having said that, I think that we have to look at the record of other governments in other European countries, including, of course, in Britain, and conclude perhaps that austerity measures have not been successful. In Britain, we are into a double-dip recession, of course. France certainly has been downgraded, but been downgraded by a body which made some quite dubious judgments in the past about banks and so on and so forth.
Turning to you, Rainbow, on this issue of the economy, is this the kind of policy that France needs?
France wants a change of direction. It's not clear whether this new policy is going to work. It is clear that the policy thus far has not been very successful. I think what we're looking at is a parallel to the 2008 American presidential election. What we've got is a very unpopular incumbent up against a less well-known candidate who promises change and promises hope. Because if the alternative to austerity is to try and grow the economy, that's something that resonates with voters because they think economic growth is a much more desirable solution. It involves less pain, it involves more jobs, it involves getting everyone back on their feet, producing more things. It sounds good. The economic reality is much more challenging, so it's an overly simplified argument. But I think it's one that appeals to people who have been suffering pain for several years now without any tangible gain to draw from it. And I think other countries are going to be watching France very closely, because if the French experiment does work, I think that's going to resonate around the whole of Europe, because everyone would obviously prefer growth to austerity. It's whether it can be achieved that's the real question.
Turning to you, John Gaffney, is that true? Is Hollande, like the American President Barack Obama, a candidate of change and hope?
Well, I think that a lot of this was electoral and rhetorical. Everybody was bashing the rich, and funnily enough, even Sarkozy. But the problem will be that assuming Hollande is elected the 7th of May, everybody's going to wake up to reality. And it will be interesting to see what the bond markets and so on, how they react to Hollande's leadership. He has managed to get a kind of slightly notions of growth amongst the other European partners as a necessary prerequisite. But you have to remember that if he doesn't deliver, we've got nearly 20% of people voted for a far-right party. So the outcome will be crucial. What will be really crucial in the years to come will be the Franco-German relationship. It's what Hollande will do, because there's been an awful lot of anti-German rhetoric flying around. The Franco-German relationship is absolutely crucial to Europe's future, and it will be interesting to see how Hollande responds to that exigency from the 7th of May onwards.
That was John Gaffney from Aston University saying France will wake up to reality the day after Mr. Hollande presumably becomes President of France. I was also joined by Rainbow Murray from Queen Mary, University of London, John Laughland from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris, and Nick Hewlett from Warwick University. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update on